I'm Bob Tomlinson. Today's lesson is the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In covering this topic, we will look at the first segment and the setting in Philadelphia. And the second segment will deal with important ideas. And then finally, we'll look at the ratification process. Now, I wanted to begin by sort of setting the scene here in Philadelphia. First, I want to go to an overhead, and it's a famous painting done of the meeting in Philadelphia. It'll show the George Washington standing here as the presiding officer of the convention. You can also easily recognize Ben Franklin and his role in the convention. Now, Mr. Washington, as we know, is a great hero in American history already, and it is not surprising that he would preside over the session. But now let me move to some other figures that I have mentioned to you before, but I want to bring them into focus again. First, we have James Madison. Madison was perhaps the top scholar of the delegates at Philadelphia in 1787. He also played a major role in developing the so-called Virginia Plan that we'll deal with later in this segment. Madison also took the most extensive notes at this convention. And later, much later, he would allow those to be published. And it's still the best primary source we have as to what was done in the convention, what was said, and by whom. Another major player in the convention was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is very old. He is, as I mentioned to you in an earlier lesson, not as active now. But Franklin is going to facilitate compromise at a critical moment in the Constitutional Convention. And when the convention was over, Mr. Franklin was going to be asked by someone outside of the convention hall, Mr. Franklin, what have we got? And he answered, a republic, if you can keep it. And it suggested that not everything was guaranteed here. Everybody at Philadelphia understood that they were engaged in somewhat of an experiment in government. Another major player is Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton does not play a big role in the convention. He will later on help get it ratified, that is the Constitution. But at the convention, he was always trying to pull the convention a little more to the right, a little more conservative approach to government. In fact, his view is rather elitist. But he is going to be an important person later on. Also, we want to look at another figure, and this man, like Hamilton, came from New York. This is Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris is a very conservative man, but Morris had a great facility of putting words to paper. In some ways, his ability reminds us of the skill that Thomas Jefferson brought to writing the Declaration of Independence. But Gouverneur Morris is going to be the person that the convention will ask to actually write the document. And it's worthy of noting, I think, that Gouverneur Morris would later write to his friends when the work was over. Writing this document wasn't hard. It was sort of a piece of cake for most parts. But there are some elements of the Constitution, he said, where the convention really never developed a consensus. And he said, I had to fudge. I had to write in such a way that one group would interpret it one way and another group would interpret it another way. And he did. Now, that was good to get it through the convention. However, it's going to create some real constitutional debates later on that eventually, indeed, will be involved in serious disputes in American history. Now, let me start talking about the convention by looking at the purpose. The stated purpose of the convention was, after all, to amend the Articles of Confederation, to amend them. When the delegates arrived in Philadelphia, and remember I pointed out that the convention convened with about 29 delegates actually in attendance, when they met, they made a decision, first of all, that they would write a new constitution, that they would not just amend, but write a new document. Now some say, well, that shows that there's some sort of conspiracy afoot. But that's, again, that's not the case. They have decided we'll try to write a new document rather than patch together the old one. Then another important decision that the delegates made was to hold secret debates. Now, everyone who cared about what's going on knew that the delegates were in Philadelphia and that they were talking about changing the national government in some way or another. But what they've decided is that they will keep their daily debates and decisions secret until they have finished the work, and they'll present the finished product to the American public. And here again, some historians who interpret all of this as a conspiracy on the part of one element of American society to do something against the interest of the other, they will note that these secret debates is some sort of proof of it. And it might even be logical, except when you realize the delegate who proposed that the convention hold secret debates was none other than George Mason of Virginia. And Mason was the leading liberal of the day. He was very suspicious of government. He was very protective of individual rights and liberties. He was the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, and later on, when the U.S. government adopts a Bill of Rights, it will be based on Mason's work. So Mason is the one that said, let's have secret debates. Why? He understood that to get anything out of this convention would require compromise, and it would be so much easier for the delegates if they could debate among themselves and then make compromises. But if you take a position in public and get into a big debate and state it in public, and then 2 or 3 days later, a week later, you have to shift position. Oh, you're weak, you're flip-flopping and whatnot. So to avoid that sort of thing and to encourage compromise, we see the convention adopting the idea of keeping things secret in the day-to-day sessions. Now, for some delegates, that was tough, but nevertheless, they were able to do that. And in fact, some are going to be very frustrated because they cannot find out about what is going on. Now, we need to take a look at some of the major proposals, some of the major plans of government put forward early in the convention. And we have a slide that will help us work our way through the major proposals. First is the Virginia Plan. Now let me point out, the Virginia Plan is also known as the Randolph Plan because Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, one of the Virginia delegates, proposes this plan officially. It's also known as the Large State Plan. Virginia was the largest state in the Union at that time. And so it's known by all three names, the Virginia Plan, the Randolph Plan, and the Large State Plan. Now, essentially, what that means, and when we look at the details of the Virginia Plan, we'll see that the Virginia Plan wanted to provide for a true national government with sovereignty, to move away from a Confederate government with each state retaining sovereignty to a true national government, and that national government being the sovereign power. Now, under the plan for the Virginia Plan, we see that it created a bicameral legislature, upper and lower house. The people would elect one branch of the legislative branch, and then the branch would elect the members of the second house. It did provide for an executive, it did provide for federal courts, and it did provide for checks and balances. The key here is that the Virginia Plan was a national government. The national government would be sovereign. And representation in that body would be based upon the number of people living in the state. So Virginia, the most populous state, would have more votes in the new proposed government than any other state. Now, this was going too far for some. The Virginians, James Madison, Governor Randolph, and others were ready for a national government, but not other delegates and some of the other states. To counteract this, William Patterson of New Jersey offers the Patterson Plan, or New Jersey Plan, or Small State Plan, and we might go back to our slide. First, we've looked at Virginia, now the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan really is something like a modified Articles of Confederation. And that means that you're going to maintain the Confederate form of government with each state still being sovereign. But the Patterson or New Jersey Plan does say this, that the new Confederate government would have the power to regulate commerce, and that's an important step, and that it would have the authority to levy new taxes, and that's an important step. But the states would retain sovereignty. There would be a unicameral legislature, one house, not two, and it would still be a Confederate government. How do you get beyond that? Well, one of the delegates from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, is going to step forward, and he's going to produce what's known as the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise. And to help me illustrate and to discuss the Great Compromise, let me go to an overhead here that briefly outlines some of the major steps. First of all, it creates a firm union of people, but it doesn't say whether or not the national government is sovereign or the states are sovereign. That's one of those things Gouverneur Morris will fudge on. Now, it will have a two-chamber legislative body, and the lower house, the House of Representatives, would be based upon population. The larger the state population, the more votes. But it would also have a Senate, and each state would have 2 votes in that Senate, no matter how large or small. And that's the key. That helped get over that barrier of voting strength. Here, the states would be equally represented in the House. The total number of people, the size of the population, would determine the voting strength under the Great Compromise. It did call for federal courts capped by a Supreme Court. It did give extensive powers to the Congress, including the power to levy taxes. It did give the Congress the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. All of those are key. It provided an amendment process, and the amendment process was a little easier under this rule than under the Articles of Confederation. Roger Sherman's plan was called the Great Compromise, and it provided a necessary mechanism to mold ideas of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan together so that you could get a majority of the delegates to say, okay, we can try that. Now, they are fearful about certain things. They're fearful about the power of the presidency. They feel like they've got to have an executive, and it's provided for. Perhaps the only reason that the delegates would vote for this is that when they looked to the front of the room, they could see George Washington, and everybody knew that Washington would be the first president. They could trust him. Now, the real issue is who comes after Washington. But Roger Sherman has provided a vehicle of compromise that would allow the delegates to go forward and begin to add meat to the skeleton form of government that he has proposed. In this segment, I'm going to cover some important ideas discussed at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. And I'm going to use my overhead to help us work our way through this. The first major idea, or important idea I think we need to look at, concerns the nature of society. What sort of society did the delegates see in America in the 18th century? Most of the delegates believe that the society of America in the 18th century was very different from the society in Europe. Americans of 1787 believed that most Americans who wanted to could acquire land and other property. They could belong to a middle class. They had many opportunities then. And that society was very, very different from Europe. And most of the opportunities clearly were in agriculture because America still had availability of land at a cheap price, very productive land. In fact, when some of the delegates started talking about the types of classes in America in 1787, they identified 3 classes: the landed class, farmers, the commercial class, and the professional class. And when you look at that, you think, well, have they left anyone out? No, not in their time. But what isn't present in American society in 1787 is a working class or a laboring class. Most Americans owned the property that they used to make a living. It's a very different society from Europe of the 18th century. So when Americans talk about the nature of society, we see that they described a very different sort of society. Another important concept that the delegates discussed concerned the purpose of government. The purpose of government. Now, the delegates in their discussion of purpose of government said, well, the purpose of government is to protect property. True. This was a nation of property holders. But they also made it clear that it was the role of government to protect human rights. This was not a convention of people concerned only with property rights, but with human rights as well. In fact, some of the delegates really didn't see the American society as dividing between property and human rights. They saw those concepts meshing together. Now, they also believed that individuals should be free to pursue an individual's interest, acquire as much property as possible, and enjoy the fruits of that work. They didn't anticipate in society that everybody would end up at the end of life with the same amount of property. So they were not visualizing a society existing in 1787 or one in the future where everybody would have the same amount of goods, but everybody would have the same opportunity to pursue one's interest and try to acquire property and enjoy life as much as possible. Another concept that the delegates recognized and discussed concerned checks and balances in government. Checks and balances in government. They saw a need to have a government that would allow one part of the government to check another part of the government. And we know that in the U.S. Constitution that comes out of the convention, we'll have a legislative branch that the president, he can veto a bill passed by the legislative branch, but they can pass the bill over his veto, two-thirds vote of both houses. And if the president and the Congress agree on something and the Supreme Court says it differed from the Constitution, the Supreme Court can invalidate it and overturn it. And so we have all sorts of ways in which power is checked, because the delegates clearly in discussing power showed that they didn't trust power. They didn't trust people who had power. Now, many years later, an Englishman is going to say, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, the Americans didn't say it that way, but that's exactly what they believed, that they were fearful of power, that government had to have power, but they wanted to try to, as best as they could, check power and have a check and balance system. Another important idea discussed is one of slavery. This almost destroyed, this just almost ripped the convention up. Slavery was a basic division. In fact, when we look at the issue of slavery, the delegates discussed it as, should slaves be counted as property or human beings, individuals or property? And how do we count them in representation? It will produce one of those great compromises, not necessarily the greatest in American history by far, but the delegates would finally decide, well, we'll count slaves in determining a state's population, and that will determine how many votes they have in the House of Representatives. And they decided not to count a slave one for one, but 3/5. Each slave would count 3/5 of a person, hence the 3/5 compromise. Another issue concerning slavery was on slave trade. Should Congress have the power to prohibit foreign slave trade, of bringing in, say, more African Americans, bringing them into America from Africa, to stop the foreign slave trade? Eventually, they will compromise and say, under the new government, the Congress in 20 years, 1808, will be able to prohibit the foreign slave trade if it chooses to. As it works out, Congress will. As soon as the Constitution permitted, the Congress would prohibit the foreign slave trade. Now, this has nothing to do with the trading of slaves between Virginia and Carolina, or Carolina and Alabama, or whatever, but only the foreign slave trade. The delegates discussed and debated slavery, the strengths of slavery, the negative features of slavery, the good and bad, the moral issue of slavery, the economic issues of slavery. Had they not worked out a 3/5 compromise, it's possible slavery as an issue would have ripped the country apart and prevented the adoption of a new U.S. Constitution. Another issue that the delegates discussed concerned large and the small states. I've already mentioned one of the big issues that divided the large and small states. One was representation. How do you deal with representation? Should each state have one vote? And they would compromise by having one house of the two-house Congress based on population and the other giving each state 2 votes. Now, in the Senate, each state has 2 senators, and the Constitution made it clear that those 2 senators didn't have to vote together. Each senator could make up his own mind and vote however he wished on any issue, but each state would have 2 votes. And you see this concern about power. Small states, very protective. A little later, we'll look at the way in which the president is elected, and the electoral college system was designed to protect the small states and to protect it from the big votes of the states with more population. Another issue, an important idea that was part of the debate, concerned democracy. Clearly, the delegates understood democracy. They knew what was involved in democracy. And the delegates also understood that the people ultimately in the various states would have to decide whether the new Constitution being written in Philadelphia was acceptable or not. In fact, over and over in the debates you see that they were talking about, we must be careful here. You might think this would make government more efficient, but the people won't accept it. And you see over and over a concern for the people, and what will the people accept and what will they not accept. That is really a driving force in the debates. And over in the debates you see a concern that the form of government reflect the will of the people, although the debates also show there's a concern about mob rule. We don't want a government that would allow the mob to take over, and that you want to protect the rights of individuals, even if they are part of a political minority. All of these ideas are debated, and it shouldn't surprise us because these are people who had formed state governments and written state constitutions and amended state constitutions. They were very experienced, not only in shaping government, but in trying to make government work. And here you see delegates concerned about not just producing a new process, a new constitution, but trying to produce something that will actually work. And finally, another major idea, and a concluding one here, is the amending process. How do you amend it? They wanted this Constitution to be the fundamental law of the land, the supreme law of the land. But they also realized that times change, the country will change. How will we go about amending this Constitution? And so they set up a process that was easier. In the past, they had to have unanimous votes. Now they're going to set up a process where 2/3 of the Congress and then 3/4 of the states can agree to a change. Or the states can ask for a constitutional convention, and then the proposal for change will go to the states, and 3/4 must accept. So they've got a fundamental law, and now they've got a proposal to amend it. And a proposal that would make it easier to amend than the old way, but still not as easy as passing a regular piece of legislation. These delegates have produced a document, as it turns out, a document that will well serve the nation for many, many generations. In this segment, we're going to look at the ratification process of the U.S. Constitution. Some 39 delegates signed the proposed U.S. Constitution in the fall of 1787 and sent it on to the states, asking the states to ratify. In the document itself, the delegates have stated that if 9 of the 13 states ratify, then that will be a sufficient number to begin the new Constitution. Those 9 would begin. Everyone understood that any state that chose not to ratify and join would be free to go its own way. But the group had decided if 9 agree, we will go ahead and then try to bring the others in as time goes on. Now, the delegates also made an important decision. They decided that they would allow the people of each state to elect the delegates to go to a state convention, and the state convention would debate the new document. Not the legislature. The people themselves would elect delegates to go to a state convention, and each of the 13 states would do that. Now, overall, we'll see that the new proposed Constitution, what we know as the U.S. Constitution, had strong support. And if we look at an overhead, we can begin to see the pattern of support that developed. The blue area shows you the Federalist or pro-Constitution support. And if we could, and later we'll look at numbers, this would represent, of all the people who voted, this would represent some 66% of all of the voters in the various states, if you tallied up all of the votes. The people voting said they favored delegates who wanted to ratify the Constitution. And that's a rather impressive number. Now, I've got another overhead that I can show you that will indicate the sequence of ratification, beginning with Delaware, unanimous support, Pennsylvania, some division, we see a lot of support for this Constitution. Now, two states had a hard time, Virginia and New York. Virginia and New York had big debates, big divisions. What's the big difference here? In Virginia, the delegates, and in New York, the delegates were concerned, this document does not contain a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights to guarantee a protection of the citizen against the authority of the national government. And they are saying, we want the Bill of Rights in there before we vote. In the end, the supporters of the Constitution, in New York, that will be Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. In Virginia, it will be James Madison and then George Washington. They will indicate that the delegates will, if the states will ratify, as soon as the new government convenes, the new Congress would propose a Bill of Rights and send it right back to the states so that the people in the states would have a chance to add a Bill of Rights to the new Constitution. That will be just enough to get the support in Virginia and New York. And we'll see later some 11 states will ratify the document. Let me look at another overhead, and we can see a contemporary political cartoon of such that tells us 11 will go ahead and ratify rather quickly, 11 states, but 2 will hold out for a while, including North Carolina and Rhode Island. Now, of course, they later joined, but initially 11 states would go through the process of electing a new Congress and implementing the new government. Americans had become convinced in these 11 states that this new Constitution was okay, that it was acceptable. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay had produced some very important articles called the Federalist Papers, some 85 different articles. And they had argued the strengths of the new government and the weaknesses of the old government. They had pictured for Americans the choice. Which is stronger? Which is better for us? And in the end, the arguments of Hamilton and Madison and Jay and George Washington and Ben Franklin and others will be enough to sway the majority of the delegates in all of the states to say, yes, this document is worth trying. They weren't sure, but they were ready to begin the experiment of Republican government under the U.S. Constitution. In 1928, Herbert Hoover won the presidency at a time of great prosperity. He and the nation both were extremely optimistic about the future. Let's take a look at what happens in the Hoover administration. First, it begins with optimism, and the little factory off to the left there symbolizes a booming economy. Let's take a look at the victory that Herbert Hoover won. Let's go to the slides and first take a look at the picture of Hoover as a young man who was vigorous, had already long before 1928 obtained the reputation of a great administrator, very efficient man, and a progressive, sort of in the mold of the Woodrow Wilson progressivism. In 1928, he ran against Al Smith of New York. And we have a picture here, one of the campaign slogans, here Smith on the left. He was the Democrat candidate in 1928. And we need to take a look at a couple of the issues that the campaign of that period covered. First of all, in the campaign, Herbert Hoover and his running mate emphasized prosperity in America. America had had a good decade in the 20s for the most part, and it appeared that the 1930s would be even better for the country, and for what was called the Republican prosperity. One of the issues that the campaign did focus on from time to time was the issue of dry versus wet. Herbert Hoover was a dry, and in the 1920s that meant he favored prohibition. He did not want to repeal the amendment that had enacted prohibition in America. He ran against Al Smith, however, who was a wet. Now, Al Smith was, I feel confident, not only a wet in public, but a wet in private. Some folks in American politics had found out that you could be dry in public and maybe a little wet in private, but Al Smith made it clear that he favored alcoholic consumption, and he felt that the experiment in prohibition had failed. Another issue would be leadership, and here Herbert Hoover could point to his service as the head of the Department of Commerce in the 1920s. He also could point to his leadership as a humanitarian. I make note here that he was a Quaker. He was the first man of the Quaker faith elected to the presidency. But Herbert Hoover had demonstrated his humanitarian concern during World War I. Even before the United States got involved, Herbert Hoover organized and administered a food relief program for people in Belgium and other areas of Europe that were facing starvation. Then once the United States got involved, of course, he was part of the administration of the food program to see, one, that we had enough food in America, but also for American troops and allies overseas. In this campaign, Herbert Hoover enjoyed the big support of the rural voters in America. There just was no close call here. He won big in rural support. But let me also point out that perhaps the only bright spot for the whole Democrat ticket in 1928 was the urban vote. For the first time in many years, the Democrat ticket had carried a majority of the urban votes in a presidential campaign. Now, it wasn't a very big margin, but for the first time in many campaigns, the Democrats could claim a majority of urban votes. Now, Herbert Hoover had won such a huge majority of rural voters that he won an easy victory, in fact, swept to a big election victory in 1928. His confidence, though, was not just based on his big victory. It wasn't just a political confidence that Herbert Hoover brought to the office with him. He believed that the country was on the threshold of something really great. And to get an idea of what he's thinking, let's look at his inauguration day, March 4, 1929, and look at some of the issues that he chose to emphasize in March of 1929. He could point out, of course, that the country in 1929 was at a time of no world crisis, that the economy in America was booming, and not only was it good now, but it was going to be better later on. He predicted, in fact, an end to want, an end to poverty in America. And he had a definition. If we can go back to the graphics, we'll see he had a little definition, a little common man's definition of what it meant to put an end to want. First, he said it meant 2 cars in every garage, and it meant 2 chickens in every pot. Prosperity would not be just for the rich, but the people in the working class would have plenty of material goods to meet their basic needs. There's some irony in this, because by the time Herbert Hoover leaves office 4 years later, the American people will not associate him with the prosperity of the 20s or even the potential growth of the American economy and the end of want, but in fact his name will be tied to the poverty in America, to the Great Depression that hits America 6 months after he enters office. In fact, we'll see by 1932 that many little communities, so-called, were called Hoovervilles. Now, what were Hoovervilles? These were little places that people put together, maybe cardboard buildings, maybe some pieces of wood, and maybe they're in a park, maybe they're in an area that nobody else wanted to be, but they've lost their homes, they've lost their businesses, and they construct these little shelters. And now they're called Hoovervilles by 1932. Also, some people had no homes, and so they slept out on park benches, and they tried to stay warm by wrapping themselves in newspaper. Newspaper is not a bad insulation. Well, those newspapers covering people on park benches were now called Hoover blankets. And some folks, to demonstrate that they were so poor that they had no money at all, sometimes would pull their pockets inside out, and the lining of their pockets hanging out were called Hoover flags. Again, Hoover's name was attached to everything that seemed to symbolize depression in this country rather than prosperity. Now, if we go back and take a look before the Depression hits, and we take a look at the good times, there are bulls on Wall Street. People are bullish on America. They're bullish on the stock market. You often hear, in fact, people talking about the bull market. Now, that means that people are confident that the prices on the stocks are going to increase, and that you buy at this price and later on sell at a higher price. And when people are confident that the prices of stocks are going up on the stock market, it's called a bull market. And in the period, say, from 1996 down to 1998, we've been in a bull market in America. Well, in the 1920s, there was a real bull market, and it was a market that everybody really wanted to get in on. In that graphic, I had a little notation that RCA stock in 1 year went from $85 a share to $420 a share. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out how you can make some money in that kind of a market. You buy. And what's happening is that people are eager to buy. There's panic buying. Now, sometimes you may be more familiar with the term of panic selling. When bad times hit, people want to get rid of their stock, and they're in a panic to get rid of it. But there's also something called a panic buying. And in the panic buying, people are just looking for money anywhere they can to go throw it into the stock market. And we're not just talking about banks and big investors, but the average person is looking for some way to pull in some money and go put it in the stock market, expecting the stock value to increase, sell it for a profit. Now, in fact, people were so confident that they were buying on the margin. That is, they were putting cash down for maybe 50% of the cost of the stock and then financing the other 50%. They might go to a bank and finance. And if banks start loaning a lot of money, or any financial institution starts loaning a lot of money to individuals buying in the stock market, then that financial institution is also speculating in the stock market, because the consumer goes in and puts 50% down, his cash, but borrows money from banks. And remember, a lot of people are doing this, big investors as well as the small investors. And that means if something happens to the value of the stock, if it goes down, then the person who borrowed the money is going to be called on by the broker. You owe us more money. The stock value has dropped. We need now more money from you. And those who are loaning the investor money loan the money based on the value of the stock. If the value of the stock drops, they're going to get a telephone call that says, all right, the value of your stock or your collateral has dropped. You've got to come up with more money. And of course, they don't have it. And what this means is that if the stock market drops precipitously, then people are going to get a phone call to put up more money, and they don't have it. And so the individuals are going to end up going broke. Those people who loan money to the stock investors are going to go broke, and the potential for disaster is there. But in 1928, people are very confident. In the early part of 1929, people are very confident. They're not looking for some sort of drop in the stock market. But if we look and say, well, we know what's coming. With 20/20 hindsight, we know that a stock market crash is going to hit in the fall of 1929. Was it inevitable? Was it unavoidable? And the answer is it could have been avoided, most likely. The financial experts tell us that if people had been buying on 75% margin, that is, if they had been putting down 75% and then borrowing 25%, then first of all, the stock values wouldn't have gone up so fast. I mean, what drives some of these stock values up? It's the demand for the stock. It's like anything else, demand and supply. And when more and more people are trying to buy, what's going to happen to the price of that something they all want? It's going to go up. If you say you've got to put down 75%, then you cannot drive that price up. Demand for that stock is not going to be as great. And so the price isn't going to go up so precipitously as so many stocks did in this period, 1928 and the first part of 1929. So if people had been putting down more, then we might have avoided the stock market crash. That doesn't mean we could have avoided a depression. And then as we go through this, we need to disassociate the crash from the depression. Now, let's take a look at some early signs of trouble that we've got on the stock market and indeed in the economy. First of all, there are some weaknesses, and American farmers have not been enjoying the prosperity that other people have been enjoying. And I just want to go over here now to a couple of slides. In the 1920s, the prairies are hit with dust storms, and they create all sorts of trouble. Now, the poor American farmers have had trouble anyway. The demand for their crops has dropped after World War I, and the farmers are in depression in the 20s, long before the Great Depression hits. And then to compound that in the 20s, we have these dust storms that are destroying the productive land in the Midwest, and farmers will pick up and move west, try to go to California. This is when you would see little signs that would say, California or bust, and they're heading west to try to find better times. I have another slide here, again, just a different picture of it. You can imagine a farmer trying to survive these dust storms. People would just literally go crazy. They'd lock themselves in the house, but the storms were so intense and the dirt was flying so hard, it would come in around the windowsills, come in under the door. They might have a foot of dirt in their house, even though they didn't have a window or a door open. The dust and dirt was just pouring in. And besides destroying their livelihoods, of course, it is just destroying them emotionally. And so it shouldn't surprise us that farmers are looking for something better. Now, it's prosperity for most people, but again, some American farmers are not enjoying that prosperity. And I might add, the coal mines were not in great shape. Now, for the most part, Americans are confident. But there are some early signs, besides the farmers still not getting any better and the miners not having a better time, or the mine owners, but we have a decline in consumer demand. And that is that there are fewer dollars going in to make demands for purchases of American-produced goods. And that should be a sign of trouble. Most people didn't pick up on it very quickly. And then we find some September 1929 jitters in the stock market prices. The New York banks at first say this market is still good, and they went in and bought publicly a lot of stock. Then the investors said, okay, the New York banks are going to keep us afloat, so they go in and start buying up again. But in October 1929, the stock market will start down, and when it goes, it really goes in a plunge, and we will be into the Great Depression, or at least the stock market crash, which is going to forecast a severe economic downturn. In fact, some of the signs of economic collapse: by the end of November 1929, a 40% drop in the value of stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. 40% drop. That is just a catastrophe. We also see that these things revealed a weakness in the economy, a drop in consumer demand, some $1 billion for residential construction, a drop in 1 year. The government would not respond to that. Laissez-faire economics said, let nature take its course. Nature had a bitter lesson to teach the nation in the 1930s. Once the stock market crashed in 1929 and continued to sag, the overall economy continued to sag as well. Sometimes we can have a dramatic drop in the stock market and not have an economic problem, not have a recession or depression. But in 1929, the drop in the stock market accurately reflected deep-seated weaknesses in the American economy. And as the economy began to deteriorate, as deflation set in and the economy shrank, we see some effects rippling out from the initial downturn. First, there's panic in the banking industry. And remember, there is no Federal Deposit Insurance. Some of the banks had been wise and frugal in their investments. They had done what a good bank should do. and they were very sound. This was an economic recession, or as in the days of the early 20th century, it was called a panic. But these banks were all right. They were ready to get through this storm. However, as the Depression continued and as the banking crisis continued, and say Mr. Brown hears that Bank A and B have gone broke in his town. They've closed their doors, and people who had checking accounts and savings accounts in those banks have lost them. Well, what's Mr. Brown going to do? He frankly is going to run as fast as his feet will carry him to his bank, Bank C. And when he gets there, probably going to be a lot of other people there too, they're all going to be demanding, give me my money. Give me all of my money right now. Now, what's going to happen to any bank when all of its depositors hit the door at the same time and all of them want all their money? It's going to fail. The bank is going to close. When banks take in our money, they don't go put it in the corner and water it and keep it there and hope that it grows. They take it out and invest it. And when all of the depositors come in on one day, then a bank, even a good bank, could be put and pressed against the wall. And that's what's going to happen in this period. There's going to be a banking panic, and that, by the way, is going to extend the Depression. One of the most natural reactions to this is, well, we're in a hard time, so we need to cut back. Businesses will have to cut back. They will cut back on wages. These wages are going to be cut back, but what does that do to demand? Well, it's going to cut demand. I mean, what is demand? It's $1 in the marketplace saying, I want to buy this. I've got $1 and I want to spend it. If you start taking dollars out of people's hands, cut their wages, you're going to cut demand. Cutting demand means the industries will have to cut their production. Cutting production means you'll have to cut employment. Cut employment and you cut demand. Cut demand, you must cut production. Cut production, you must cut employment. Cut employment, you cut demand. Cut demand, you cut production. And what's happening is we're just jamming the economy down. All of the decisions seem to be right. I mean, you've got to cut back. You don't have the money. But the decisions of state government to cut back on spending, the decisions of the federal government to cut back on spending, the decisions of individuals to cut back on spending, and they really don't have any choice, is only going to drive the economy further down into a collapse. Another rippling effect is a drop of investment. In the 1920s, people were confident, so they invested in new factories, new machineries for production, new technology. Capital investment meant spending money. The market doesn't care where the dollar comes from. Comes from a big corporation, comes from an individual, comes from a state, comes from federal government. It doesn't matter. A dollar's a dollar. And a dollar in the marketplace is demand. Demand means production. Production means an expansion of the economy. Higher wages, more buying, more spending. What's happening now is all of that's collapsing in on itself. Another indication of real tragedy is the shrinkage of the GNP, the gross national product. The gross national product is the total value of all goods and services produced in the economy in a year. Just before the Depression set in, the gross national product of the United States was $104.4 billion. Very impressive. The GNP 4 years later has shrunk to $74.2 billion. Now that means millions of jobs lost, values of stock have just disappeared. This is the tragedy expressed in numbers. It is an awful economic catastrophe, so bad that some thought, well, our whole private economic system has failed. Capitalism has failed. As it turns out, capitalism hasn't failed. We're going to recover from that, and the capitalist system itself is going to recover. But millions of people are being hurt, and many are beginning to ask questions, what can we do? Well, unfortunately, the news keeps getting bad. In fact, we have just more bad news coming up. The income of labor, people who just work for wages, drops from 51 billion down to 29.5 billion. Business failures increased by 33%. Farm prices continue to decline. Now remember, the poor farmers were in depression in the 1920s, and we'll see that their farm income is going to continue to go down. If we look at this, I'll catch up. Business failures and farm price decline. The poor farmers, their prices are continuing to decline in the 30s, and they've already been in a depression for 10 years. This is a horrific experience for American farmers. Also, imports are going down by 66% over a 4-year period. What about the employment numbers or unemployment? The unemployment figure in 1929 was about 3.1%. In 4 years, it stands at 25+%. I've got a plus there because we know we have 25% unemployed, but after 4 years, some people aren't looking for work anymore. There's nothing there to find, and so they drop off the charts. They're not even counted. We may have had as many as, say, 30% nationwide unemployed, and that doesn't help us deal with the underemployed. What about those people who are working but are not working in an area that they really are trained for? They're not using all of their skills. Just to let me give you an idea, let's go over here to our slides and we'll see what I'm talking about. This shows a man on a street corner. He indeed may have been a salesman, he may have been a manager, but how's he trying to live now? He's selling apples on the street corner. Well, somebody might say he's employed, but he is underemployed, and our numbers don't tell us much about that. We also associate with the Depression another picture I've got on the slide here. This is a soup kitchen. These are found in all of the major cities of America. People who've been formerly employed now are unemployed. They've lost their homes as well as their jobs. Indeed, some have seen their families break up. This is the tragedy of the Great Depression. I might add, with the families, initially when the hard times hit, the families pulled together. But after 2 and 3 and 4 years, then many of the families begin to break and to splinter, as people just can't understand why times can't get better. I've mentioned the unemployment rates for the nation. Some of the cities might tell you just how bad it was. In Chicago, the unemployment rate at the height of the Depression, 50%. In Cleveland, a big industrial town in the Midwest, 50% unemployed. In Toledo, Ohio, a thoroughly industrialized town, 80% of workers unemployed. These are hard times indeed. Now, with this hard time, how can we explain it? Why do we have it? First, we can look back and say that when a decline in the demand, a decline in the economy occurred, and there was no government action to stimulate demand or to stimulate investment, then the economy continued to drop, continued to collapse, and it was going to be a long time getting back from it. Another is too much attention during the 20s had been put on production. How can we maximize production? And not spending enough time on looking at demand. What's happening to demand? Productivity in companies on the average went up 43%, 1919 to 1929, yet wages remained relatively stable. And so nothing much was done with demand. Looking at productivity, you could say, well, we could increase wages and even cut prices to stimulate demand. But neither of those was done to any great measure in the 20s. There was simply too much emphasis on production, not enough on the demand side of the economy. And also we see that there were just some deep-seated weaknesses, a poor distribution of income. The American income was moving more and more top-heavy. A very small percentage of the top control a lot of the income and wealth in the country. Now, there's nothing wrong about that. There's nothing evil or unethical. But from an economic standpoint, if people don't have dollars, they cannot spend. And this sort of uneven economy and uneven distribution of income produced something that I want to try to just illustrate here with my little crude drawing. I've demonstrated here in the 20s, the American economy became dependent upon 2 areas of spending: luxury spending and investment in capital goods. Now, when trouble comes, where do you think the first 2 areas people will cut back on spending? Where do you think they will cut back? They will cut back on luxury spending and capital investment. And so the 2 big props of the economy are going to go down real hard as soon as the storm clouds appear. That is going to help explain why it was so hard to get out of this depression. What about Hoover and the Depression? First of all, we could say Mr. Hoover named it. Initially, people called economic downturns, they called them panics. Well, Mr. Hoover didn't like that term. He said, look, this is not a panic. This is like a depression. You get up one morning, you're a little depressed, but by the afternoon, you get over it and things go on. Of course, later, depression is going to be associated with what happens, and depression gets to be a much tougher word, a harder word than recession or panic ever was. But more to it, what did he do? At first, he felt the president and the federal government had a very limited role to play, that private charity and the states should jump in and take care of people who were hurt. He believed in laissez-faire, let nature run its course. The federal government shouldn't be handing money out to people. The federal government shouldn't be trying to manipulate the economy. The Congress passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff. That was a protective tariff. All that did was to cut demand for American goods by cutting off foreigners who would buy American goods. If you make it hard for foreigners to buy in America, they're going to make it hard for you to sell over in their country. He and the Congress rejected the call for an early payment of the bonus to World War I veterans. When we look over and see, at the end, what did Hoover do? He begins to see that his laissez-faire economics is not working. And he begins to use public money to try to stimulate an economy. That's a big thing for him to do. But the states, when he is spending more, the states are cutting their spending. And we'll end up seeing a negative growth in the spending of government to try to increase demand in the American economy and to try to pump the economy back up. Hoover, too late, has figured out a method that he could use. Solving that problem will be for another president.